On a morning in late June 1992, fishermen in Newfoundland went out to the Grand Banks, as they had gone out every day for most of their lives, and came back with almost nothing. Catches had been declining for years. Most people in the industry had a theory about why. 2 days later, the Canadian government announced a moratorium on northern cod fishing across the entire Grand Banks. 40,000 people lost their livelihoods in a single federal announcement. The measure was described as temporary, a pause to allow stocks to recover. 30 years later, the cod have not come back. The fish that built an Atlantic economy for 5 centuries, that fed the workers of the medieval Mediterranean, financed the settlement of New England, and gave Norway its first global export, had been removed from the ocean faster than the ocean could replace it. The collapse of the Grand Banks cod fishery is one of the most complete ecological disasters in the history of food. It is also a story that begins not in 1992, but 1,100 years earlier, on the coast of Norway, where someone discovered that winter air could do something that no salt, no smoke, and no fermentation could match. Stockfish is dried cod. The technology is almost offensively simple. Take a fresh cod, remove the head and gut, tie the fish in pairs by the tail, and hang them on wooden racks outside in the cold, dry wind of a Norwegian winter. Over 3 months of freezing and thawing, the flesh loses roughly 4/5 of its water content. What remains is something close to pure protein, light, hard as wood, impervious to spoilage in a way that no other large animal food product can match. A stockfish can be stored for 2 years without refrigeration, in conditions that would destroy almost anything else. The comparison that clarifies what this meant in a pre-refrigeration world is simple. Fresh fish spoils within hours of being caught, unless you are within walking distance of the sea. Salted fish lasts longer, but requires large quantities of salt, which in Northern Europe was expensive and scarce. Smoked fish has a limited shelf life and needs specific equipment. Stockfish requires nothing except cod, wooden racks, and Norwegian winter air. That climate combination is found in specific places along the Norwegian coast, particularly the Lofoten Islands, where the Gulf Stream moderates temperatures to precisely the range in which freeze-thaw drying works best without freezing the fish solid. The Lofoten Islands are not a hospitable place for humans. The archipelago sits at 68 degrees north latitude, well above the Arctic Circle, in a sea that produces some of the most violent winter storms in European waters. But the islands face the open Atlantic, and the Gulf Stream keeps them warmer than their latitude would otherwise allow. The water off their coasts is extraordinarily rich in cold water fish that the current brings from the depths of the Norwegian Sea. The islands turned out to be the ideal natural factory for the product that would reshape the medieval economy. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because the geography aligned the requirements of cod fishing with the requirements of stockfish production in a single, improbable location. The earliest evidence of large-scale stockfish production in the Lofotens dates to around 800 to 900 AD. This coincides, not accidentally, with the beginning of the Viking Age. The standard account of the Viking Age emphasizes the longship, the axe, and the raid. These are real, but they are incomplete. The other technology that made the Viking expansion possible was portable, preserved food, specifically stockfish. A longship crew on an extended expedition required substantial food to maintain the physical performance that rowing and fighting demanded. Fresh food was impossible to carry at sea for more than a few days. Grain and hardtack could supply calories, but not protein in the quantities that sustained hard physical labor. Salted meat was expensive, heavy, and relatively scarce in Scandinavia. Stockfish solved all of these problems at once. It was lighter than any alternative protein source by a factor of 5. It lasted indefinitely, It was produced in large quantities in the Lofoten Islands, which happened to be at the heart of the Norse world. And it could be eaten without cooking in an emergency, broken off in chunks and chewed slowly, rehydrating gradually in the mouth. A long ship carrying stockfish could range far beyond the safe return distance of any vessel relying on fresh provisions, because the protein supply did not degrade with distance or time. The logistics of the Viking Age were, in a fundamental sense, stockfish logistics. The expansion of the Norse world in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries tracks closely with the development of stockfish production. The Orkney Islands, the Faroe Islands, Iceland. The island-hopping route across the North Atlantic that Norse settlers followed corresponds almost exactly to the islands where Atlantic cod was available and where the climate permitted stockfish production. The settlers brought the technology with them. The new settlements became self-sustaining when local fish populations could support local production. By 985 AD, Eric the Red had established a settlement in Greenland. His son Leif sailed from there around 1000 AD and landed somewhere on the North American coast, a place he called Vinland, most likely the coast of what is now Newfoundland, or the Maritimes. Archaeological excavations at Longso Meadows in Newfoundland confirmed the Norse presence there around this date. Leif's settlement lasted a few years and was then abandoned. Conflict with indigenous populations, the difficulty of maintaining supply lines from Greenland, and the absence of land suitable for Norse-style agriculture all contributed to the failure. The Norse came, spent some time, and left. But the specific location of Vinland points towards something that would prove enormously consequential. Leif Erikson had sailed directly over the Grand Banks, without knowing what was beneath him. The Grand Banks is a submarine plateau extending about 300,000 square kilometers off the southern coast of Newfoundland, where the cold Labrador Current meets the warmer Gulf Stream. The collision of these two water masses creates exceptional conditions for plankton growth, and the plankton support an extraordinary concentration of marine life. At their peak, the Grand Banks held the largest population of Atlantic cod in the world. Some estimates put the total biomass at tens of millions of tons. Early European visitors described a sea so thick with fish that it impeded the passage of ships. John Cabot, reaching the banks in 1497, wrote that fish were so abundant that baskets lowered into the water came back full without a hook. The ecology that made this possible was ancient and complex. The Grand Banks had been accumulating biological productivity for tens of thousands of years, since the last glaciation created the shallow water continental shelf that allows sunlight to penetrate to the seabed and support the dense growth of bottom-dwelling organisms that juvenile cod depend on. The cod were not simply there because the water was cold and the plankton were abundant. They were there because the entire ecosystem had co-evolved around them for millennia. The capelin they ate, the prey those capelin ate, the temperature gradients they navigated seasonally, the spawning sites they returned to year after year. It was a system of extraordinary stability and productivity built over geological time. It took 40 years of industrial fishing to break it. Leif Erikson, sailing along the coast of Newfoundland around 1000 AD, was passing directly over what would later prove to be the greatest cod fishery in the Atlantic. He could not have known this. The scale of the banks is not visible from the surface, and the Norse explorers were looking for timber and agricultural land suitable for the kind of farming settlement that had made Iceland viable. They found the coast forested, but the indigenous populations hostile, and the supply line from Greenland too long to sustain a permanent colony. They left. It would be another 500 years before European fishing vessels returned to the banks in force. This gap, 500 years between the Norse contact and the systematic European exploitation of the banks is one of the more consequential near misses in history. The fish waited. The Norse went home and continued developing their stockfish trade closer to home. And the banks accumulated the centuries of undisturbed biological productivity that would make them, when Europeans finally returned with boats fast enough to work them in any weather and equipment capable of fishing at depth, almost unbelievably rich. While the Grand Banks waited, the stockfish trade was building something unprecedented in European commerce. Bergen, on the southwestern coast of Norway, became the distribution point for Lofoten stockfish in the 12th and 13th centuries. The fish came down the coast from the Lofotens in large quantities each summer and was traded at Bergen for the grain, cloth, and manufactured goods that Norway could not produce domestically in sufficient quantity. The trade was genuinely mutual. Bergen needed what the South produced. The South needed the protein that Bergen supplied. The merchants who organized this trade were primarily German, operating through the network of cities and trading posts that became the Hanseatic League, the first multinational commercial organization in European history. The Hanseatic presence in Bergen, centered on the Bruggen waterfront that still stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, dominated the city's economy for nearly 4 centuries. At its peak, the German Kontor in Bergen was one of the 4 major Hanseatic offices in Europe, alongside London, Bruges, and Novgorod. The League traded in dozens of commodities, but stockfish was among the most valuable and the most reliable. The Lofoten cod run was annual and predictable. Stockfish kept well enough to be traded across the continent over months or years without spoilage. The economic geography that the Hanseatic stockfish trade created was remarkable in its reach. Lofoten cod caught in winter and dried over the spring arrived in Bergen by summer. German merchants purchased it and shipped it to ports across northern Europe. It eventually reached Italy, Spain, and Portugal, where the Catholic Church's requirement for abstinence from meat on Fridays and throughout Lent created enormous permanent demand for preserved fish that could be distributed far from any coast. This demand was structural, built into the liturgical calendar, and therefore stable across centuries. Over 3 centuries, Bergen stockfish and Hanseatic logistics supplied much of Catholic Europe with its obligatory fish protein. In a pre-industrial world where a considerable fraction of the population was malnourished through winter, a reliable, transportable, long-lasting protein source was a public health infrastructure as much as a commodity. The Hanseatic fish trade kept people alive in numbers that can only be estimated, not counted. The League's power eventually declined as nation-states asserted control over northern European trade. But Bergen's role as a fish trading center persisted. The stockfish kept coming from the Lofotens and kept going south. Portugal entered the cod story from a different direction. Portuguese fishermen were already operating in the North Atlantic in the late 15th century, developing the navigational and shipbuilding capabilities that would produce the Great Age of Discovery. When John Cabot's 1497 voyage revealed the Grand Banks to broader European awareness, Portuguese fishing vessels were on the banks within years and may have arrived even earlier, following knowledge the Portuguese state was keeping from competitors. The Portuguese relationship with salt cod, Bacalhau, became one of the defining characteristics of Portuguese cuisine, culture, and identity over the following 5 centuries. Portugal, unlike Norway, had access to cheap salt from its Atlantic coast and from Mediterranean trade networks. Portuguese fishermen salted their cod at sea in the banks, which was impractical for air drying, but allowed them to stay on the fishing grounds for an entire season before returning to Lisbon with holds full of preserved fish. The 2 technologies, Norwegian stockfish and Portuguese bacalhau, addressed the same problem using different methods suited to different geographies. Both worked. Both created economies and traditions of their own kind. The Portuguese claimed to have 365 recipes for bacalhau. One for every day of the year is disputed in its specifics, but accurate in spirit. Salt cod became so embedded in Portuguese food culture that it acquired the name O Fiel Amigo, the faithful friend. It was the food of sailors on the voyages that built the Portuguese Empire. The food that sustained a population too poor to eat fresh meat reliably. Eventually, it became the food that Portuguese immigrants carried to Brazil, to Angola, to Goa, and to every territory in the Portuguese world. The culinary traditions of bacalhau that persist in all those places today trace their origin to the same grand banks that Leif Erikson sailed over without understanding what lay beneath him. In Brazil, bacalhau appears in hundreds of regional preparations that have diverged from Portuguese originals over 5 centuries into something distinctly Brazilian. In Macau, the influence of Portuguese salt cod has blended with Chinese culinary technique. The fish that a Norwegian fisherman hauled from the North Atlantic and a Portuguese sailor salted in a ship's hold off Newfoundland is now as central to the food identity of 4 continents as it is to any European culture. The British discovery of the Grand Banks, following Cabot's 1497 voyage, eventually produced consequences for North American settlement that dwarf even Portugal's bacalhau culture in their long-term scale. The fish that drew European vessels to the North Atlantic coast in the 16th century were also what made permanent settlement there economically viable in the 17th. The Pilgrims who arrived at Plymouth in 1620 came for religious freedom, but they stayed because of fish. The New England coast had abundant cod, and dried and salted cod produced in New England could be traded to the Caribbean sugar islands for molasses. New England distillers turned that molasses into rum, which could be traded for British manufactured goods or exchanged for enslaved people in West Africa. This triangle of commerce made Boston wealthy decades before manufacturing or substantial agriculture could sustain the population. Cod made New England possible as an economic proposition before the region could feed itself from its own soil. The carved wooden cod that hangs in the Massachusetts State House, the sacred cod, has been there in some form since the 17th century. It was moved to the new State House in 1798 explicitly to honor the importance of the fish to the colony's survival. It is not decorative. When it was placed in the legislature, everyone in the room understood exactly what it represented. The cod had made the colony. The colony had built its economy around the fish. Everyone understood the relationship was not metaphorical. By the late 18th century, New England fishing vessels were operating across the Grand Banks and as far north as Labrador, and conflicts over fishing rights in those waters were major factors in both the American Revolution and the subsequent diplomacy between the new United States and Great Britain. The right to fish the banks was treated in some negotiations with the same seriousness as territorial sovereignty, not disproportionately. The banks were worth fighting over, and everyone knew it. For most of the 5 centuries that European fishing vessels worked the Grand Banks, the technology was consistent. Sailing ships, hand lines or long lines set from dories, salting or drying in Newfoundland outports or on board. A vessel might catch several hundred tons of fish in a season. This was a substantial harvest, but the Grand Banks were vast, the fish population was enormous, and the technology was limited enough that the damage was not cumulative at a scale that threatened the total stock. The cod reproduced faster than they were being caught. The system was sustainable, not by design, but by the coincidence of technological limitation with biological capacity. That coincidence ended in the 1950s and 1960s with 2 related developments: sonar and factory ships. Sonar, developed for submarine detection in World War II, and adapted for commercial fishing in the post-war period, allowed fishing vessels to locate schools of fish with a precision that traditional fishermen could not approach. A fleet equipped with sonar did not need to guess where the fish were or wait for the right season. It could find them wherever they were and follow them wherever they went, through fog, through night, through weather that would have kept traditional fleets in port. Factory ships completed the transformation. Large vessels, some exceeding 100 meters, could process, freeze, and store fish at sea indefinitely, eliminating the logistical constraints that had previously limited how long a vessel could stay on the banks. A factory ship could catch and process thousands of tons of fish in a season. The Soviet Union deployed these vessels in large fleets across the North Atlantic in the 1950s and 60s, joined by fleets from Spain, Portugal, West Germany, Poland, and others. At the peak of this distant water fishing effort, the Grand Banks were worked by hundreds of vessels from more than a dozen countries simultaneously, operating around the clock and around the calendar. The scale of the Soviet operation, in particular, was unlike anything the Banks had seen. A single Soviet fleet might include 40 or 50 vessels of various sizes: trawlers, factory ships, refrigerated transport vessels, even a floating fish meal plant, organized as a self-contained industrial unit that could stay at sea for months. These fleets were not fishing in the traditional sense. They were extracting a resource. The distinction matters because extraction is not constrained by the same feedback mechanisms that traditional fishing was. When a local fishing community overfished their grounds, they felt the consequences immediately and directly in their own catches. When a Soviet factory fleet on the Grand Banks caught too many fish, the consequences fell on Canadian fishermen the following season, and on their children's season after that. The catch statistics from these decades told a story that should have been legible to anyone who chose to read them. Total annual catch on the Grand Banks peaked at roughly 800,000 tons per year in the late 1960s, then fell sharply in the early 1970s. It never returned to those levels. Canada extended its exclusive economic zone to 200 miles offshore in 1977, displacing most of the foreign factory fleets. A decision welcomed by Canadian fishing communities as a restoration of their traditional resource. What happened next was not restoration. The Canadian government, responding to pressure from those communities and from the provinces that depended on the fishery, expanded the domestic Canadian fleet rather than reducing overall fishing pressure. New licenses were issued, new vessels were subsidized, and quotas were set based on scientific advice that was itself shaped by the economic and political interests of the communities the fishery supported. The science was not hidden. Geoffrey Hutchings, a marine biologist at Dalhousie University in Halifax, and Ransom Myers, his colleague, published analyses in the late 1980s and early 1990s showing the Grand Banks cod population had fallen to a fraction of its historical size. Their papers appeared in peer-reviewed journals and were publicly available. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans had access to the same data and reached different conclusions. Conclusions that, perhaps not coincidentally, supported the continuation of the industry at its current scale. Hutchings later wrote about the experience with the bluntness of someone who had watched an entirely preventable disaster occur while those with authority to prevent it chose not to. The department, he argued, had optimized its population estimates to support higher quotas, dismissed evidence of decline when it conflicted with economic interests, and failed to apply the precautionary principle that basic fisheries management demanded. When the stock fell to levels at which recovery was extremely difficult, the department continued setting quotas based on models that assumed recovery was already underway. The fish were disappearing faster than the models acknowledged, because the models had not been designed to be right. They had been designed to be acceptable. Atlantic cod is not a fast reproducing species. A female cod does not reach reproductive maturity until she is between 3 and 5 years old. A large, old female produces far more eggs, and eggs of better quality, more likely to survive to adulthood than a young, small female. Decades of industrial fishing had not just reduced the total number of cod, it had selectively removed the oldest and largest fish, which were the most commercially valuable, leaving behind a population that was younger, smaller, and reproductively less capable than what had existed before. The biological legacy of that selective pressure made recovery substantially harder than the models predicted, even after fishing pressure was reduced. When the moratorium was announced in June 1992, it was not a surprise to the fisheries scientists who had been tracking the population. It was a surprise to the fishing communities of Newfoundland and Labrador, who had been told through years of quota decisions and government statements that the stock was under stress but manageable, serious but under control. The stock had passed the threshold below which recovery is extremely difficult. It was not impossible, but dependent on conditions that do not occur on human timescales of political patience. The moratorium displaced approximately 40,000 people whose livelihoods were directly dependent on the cod fishery. Many of the coastal outports of Newfoundland, communities that had been fishing these waters since the 1500s, that traced their identity through fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers who had fished the same grounds, had no economic alternative. The federal government provided compensation payments and retraining programs, and some people eventually found other work. What could not be replaced was the industry itself, or the culture organized around it. Outport Newfoundland had been a fishing civilization for 400 years. The fishing was not a job that people did. It was what the communities were. When it ended, many of them did not adjust. They emptied. The town of St. John's, the capital, absorbed some of the displaced workers and eventually found new economic footing through oil industry development in the offshore. The outports did not have that option. Many have continued to lose population steadily since 1992. The children and grandchildren of those 40,000 fishermen are, to a substantial degree, now in Alberta, working in the oil sands, or in Ontario, or in Fort McMurray, or anywhere that is not Newfoundland. The communities remain on the map. Whether they remain communities in any meaningful sense is a harder question. The cod stocks in the northern Grand Banks remain, more than 30 years after the moratorium, at around 5% of their pre-collapse levels. Some partial recovery has occurred in limited areas. The full recovery that the federal government promised when it described the moratorium as temporary has not happened. Some marine biologists now believe it may never happen at the historical scale, because the collapse changed the ecosystem in ways that prevent cod from recovering even without fishing pressure. The species that were prey for cod, crab, and shrimp expanded to fill the ecological space that cod's disappearance created. The system appears to have shifted to a new, stable state. The ocean is not waiting for the cod to come back. It has moved on. The full accounting of what cod made possible in the Atlantic world runs from the Norse expansion of the 9th century to the founding of New England in the 17th century, to the commercial structures of the Hanseatic League, to the dietary traditions of Portugal, Brazil, Angola, and the Caribbean. No other single species of marine fish has shaped the human world as completely or across as many dimensions. Mark Kurlansky, whose history of cod remains the definitive modern account, titled it simply Cod, a biography of the fish that changed the world. The title is not an exaggeration. The technology that made all of this possible, stockfish, the Norwegian invention of freeze-drying before anyone had a word for it, is still in use. The Lofoten Islands still produce stockfish on wooden racks, using methods that have not changed fundamentally since the 9th century. Norway exports tens of thousands of tons of stockfish annually, primarily to Italy and Nigeria. These are two of the most enthusiastic cod markets in the world today, connecting places that share almost nothing else culturally or historically, except that Norwegian dried cod arrived in both of them during the medieval period and never left. A dried Norwegian cod, shipped to Lagos or Rome today, is, in its essential technology, the same product that loaded Viking longships 11 centuries ago. What changed was the scale. The same protein that Viking raiders carried across the North Atlantic in quantities sufficient to sustain extended military campaigns was also capable of being produced at industrial scale. When industrial-scale fishing technology met a species that had taken millions of years to build its populations to levels that seemed, to every generation that exploited them, essentially inexhaustible, the outcome was not difficult to predict in retrospect. The word inexhaustible appears repeatedly in historical descriptions of the Grand Banks. Early accounts speak of fish so thick you could walk on them. Colonial accounts describe catches that seemed impossible. 19th century accounts describe a bounty that no human effort could meaningfully deplete. Each generation passed this conviction to the next, and each generation was working from a baseline already depleted below what had been normal before. What looked like abundance was already a fraction of what had existed. The wooden racks still stand in the Lofoten Islands. The stockfish still hangs in the cold winter air, losing its water slowly in the freeze-thaw cycles that Norwegian fishermen have been exploiting for 1,100 years. The technology works exactly as it always did. The cod being dried there today are caught from managed stocks in Norwegian territorial waters, stocks that have been handled more carefully than the Grand Banks were. Part of the reason is what happened in Newfoundland in 1992. Part is that Norwegian fisheries management has historically been more insulated from the short-term pressures that distorted Canadian decisions. The 40,000 people who lost their livelihoods when the Moratorium was announced had a connection to those Lofoten racks that ran unbroken across 11 centuries. What ended in 1992 was not just a fishery. It was the longest continuous food production tradition in the Atlantic world, a technology and a culture and an economy that had persisted through the Black Death, through colonial wars, through 2 world wars. It could not persist through 40 years of industrial fishing. The math was always in the data. Nobody wanted to do the math when the alternative was maintaining 40,000 jobs. Leif Erikson sailed back to Greenland around 1001 AD, having spent perhaps a single winter in Vinland. He was looking for something that cod country didn't offer: farmable land, a sustainable temperature, a place where the Norse agricultural model could take hold. He found instead a forested coast with hostile inhabitants, sailed directly over the greatest concentration of protein in the North Atlantic, and left without understanding what he had found. 500 years later, Europeans returned and spent the next 500 years catching that protein until it was gone. There is a way to read this as a story about ignorance. Leif's ignorance of what lay beneath him, and the 20th century's ignorance of what the catch statistics were saying. But the two ignorances are not the same kind. Leif could not have known. The Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans had the data. The data said what it said. The choice was not between knowing and not knowing. It was between knowing and acting. And that is a much harder problem than ignorance. It is the problem that has destroyed every fish stock in history that has been destroyed. And it is the problem that will determine what remains in the ocean for those who come after us. The irony that runs through the whole story is this: the technology which made the exploitation possible was built by people solving real problems. How to preserve food, how to feed distant populations, how to make a living from the sea. Each step made sense at the scale at which it was taken. The aggregate of those steps produced a disaster at a scale that no individual step could see. This is not a story about greed, although greed played a role. It is a story about the difficulty of managing a shared resource across generations, across political boundaries, and across the gap between what biology requires and what economics demands. That gap has never been easy to close. In Newfoundland in 1992, it turned out to be impossible.